So when we first spoke about this series, Omid highlighted to me that it's the important, talking about the Muslim American community. And in order to really delve into that, I should first mention that I am not an American by US American Muslim. I'm Canadian, which I think is infinitely better. That's okay, you guys can applaud that. It's true, yeah. No, really, you can, no, I'm kidding. I like how there's just a bunch of people. Is everybody here from the US?
No, I'm Kenyan.
Oh, you're, okay.
No, I'm glad I'm Kenyan.
Okay, who else is from abroad? Okay, where are you from?
Pakistan.
And? Switzerland. And is everybody else born and raised here in the States? Okay, so then you guys will know what I'm talking about. I argue better than anybody. When I say that when I first came to the US, I came in the capacity as somebody who worked for an international organization. And what that meant was that I got to work on global policies in the United States, but with the protection of being not an American, which meant that I could critique the US. I could say, listen, the US needs to do better on X, Y, and Z, but I was never necessarily held responsible for it, right? At the same time in Canada, we had a prime minister called Stephen Harper. Now, Stephen Harper was, for us, arguably, the most kind of conservative of the conservative, the most left of the left that we had ever had in office. He started, I don't know if you guys famously remember when he was running for election, he started something called the Cultural Barbaric Hotline. Yeah, I know, right?
Oh, a very expressive face. Please don't look at me. I don't want to be telling you how I'm feeling about you.
Cultural Barbaric Hotline, which people are supposed to call when they think their neighbors or their minorities in the community were doing something that was culturally barbaric. You can imagine how well that went down. The hotline had a lot of spam phone calls within about 10 minutes about their kids not going to bed on time, et cetera, et cetera. So Canadians had a pretty good sense of humor about it. But it really did lead to a groundswell of support for the alternative and new democratic parties. Canada's predominantly, it's a multi-party system, but three big ones, right? Whereas the States is a very bi-party system. Now, why that's important and why I mention that before I delve into the American Muslim experience or American minority, and I'm going to speak about minorities more generally because I don't specifically work with the American Muslim community, I work on global minority issues, is because of the reaction. That's what I actually think is important. Not who was in power. Harper was in power for us for 10 years. And if we talk about the US, you guys are probably going to have a lot of opportunities in the next 6 years because I do believe that if Trump closes 4, he's getting 8. I think almost any analyst or strategist will tell you the same thing. So you're looking at a reality of leadership that is defunct for the next 6 years, arguably. What that means is the reaction becomes a lot more important than the action, each and every time. If you have a situation like Canada, where it took us 10 years to really begin to mobilize, organize, and be able to do something about the situation, then I would think that's very unfortunate. There are 3 key things that I would mention for the reaction, and that we can go into in detail, and you guys can ask about in detail, but they've been the 3 things that really do separate successful, and I won't call it a resistant movement because I think that's overused, but successful engagements versus non-successful. And the very first is knowing your audience. One of the greatest, I would argue, tragedies in the US is that there seems to be a misunderstanding about who everyone's audience is. The only people who have it right, or the only person, is the person in the White House. There seems to be a very clear disconnect within minorities communities themselves about who their audience is. We play a lot of appeasement politics, where we're just the nice minority. Don't say anything bad about us, where we play nice, we graduate, we're all lawyers, doctors, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we talk about when we talk about minorities deserving respect. If you guys can remember the last time somebody spoke up on Muslim rights, or if you had a keynote speaker at a large convention, they are one of 3 things. They are a prominent lawyer or politician, a prominent doctor, or some sort of community health worker, or somehow related to somebody in the military or in the military themselves. Those are the 3 things that we give of value to minorities in this space, right? Arguably the 4th is a reformed former extremist and or reformed gang member, et cetera, somebody who shows that through the American way they have reformed and now become better people, right? But that's who we give platforms to. That's who we elevate in this particular discourse. We very rarely elevate the same voices you would hear in your local community center, mosque, neighborhood, school, etc. We don't. We don't say, hey, listen, we're Uber drivers, but that's okay, we deserve respect anyways. We don't say that, right? We say we contribute to the economy, give us human rights because we, ensure economic growth, and we're all very intelligent, so you're going to have a much better outlook in the future, which in any truly democratic and civilized society should not be a metric that you have to use to deserve basic human rights, right? So that's number one, is knowing our audience. Now, the reason I mention the importance of knowing our audience is the very first time when I was 21, the very first time I walked into a room of, I would say, much older, much whiter, much more men, people, my closest mentor, who is somebody I admire greatly, who himself is a much older white man, said to me, listen, you have 4 things that are going to stand out. You have your age, you have your gender, you have your ethnicity, and you have your religion. And when you walk into that room, literally regardless of how intelligent you are or what you say, you're going to have to combat those 4 things in each person in that room's mind. Every single person. That's what they see when they look at you. And until you say enough things that they think are of value, they are going to continue to have that impression of you. Now, at the time, when you're 21 and you hear something like this, you immediately find it borderline insulting, borderline confusing, and kind of like, well, who cares what they think? When the reality is you do need to know your audience, especially in global diplomacy. The challenge then for minority communities is, who is your audience? You guys can answer. Who is your audience? We can think of the minority community you exist in. It can be the Muslim community, it can be minority Jewish community, Christian community, black community. Who is your audience?
Okay, I happen to be that one person that has all the minority things. So I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm an immigrant, I'm an African, and I have to always think of all these facets because I grew up in a patriarchal society. So maybe, especially as a woman, when you have to fight to be educated and to say, hey, I need to be seen as human. So it's been amazing for me to be able to know when I'm talking to different people.
But who's your audience?
I don't know. Who's my audience?
Who's your audience? Who can answer that question?
People that look like me or not? Wait, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. That came out wrong.
No, I don't.
I don't know. Do you want to say my audience should be the different facets of me? Or
No, that's not usually who your audience is, interestingly enough. Who's your audience? If you're a student, who here is a student? Who's your audience?
Other students, maybe faculty.
Other students, faculty, your parents, maybe your friends' parents, right? That's who your daily audience is, right? That's who you interact with daily. Those are the people that give you credibility if you're ever going to go somewhere else, right? When you run for office in 30 years, they're going to say, hey, her roommate at Duke said that she was always throwing CDs out the window. Or I don't know what kids do these days, but you were doing something wild, right? And she was a wasteful human being and she shouldn't run. 30 years later, that's going to come up, right? Because that's her audience. So if you are a head of state, who's your audience? If you're the president of the United States, who's your audience? Who's your audience?
I feel like I'm really confused by the question.
If you are Donald Trump,
yeah.
Who do you have to engage, interact, and convince on a daily basis?
White, evangelical, Christians, and Roman.
You're not confused by the question. You had the perfect answer.
No, but I think when you ask, because I thought I got confused because when you started and saying we need to know our audience, I thought maybe we need to know who to air our grievances to.
No.
Confused.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit. That's a fair statement. Let's go back a little bit. Your audience is not who you air your grievances to.
Oh.
Your audience is who you gain credibility with. They're two different things, right? So let's go back a little bit. Within minority communities, and that's actually part of point 3, but I guess I'll mention it now since it's come up. Within minority communities, there is the prescribed position of victim, always, right? If a minority community speaks up, oftentimes it's because something happened, somebody vandalized something, somebody attacked someone, etc. So oftentimes when they're in the news, they're either solely perpetrators or solely victims, very rarely anything in the middle, right? They're not just basic human beings. But your audience and your community are two different things. You air your grievances oftentimes to your community. That should be your first place of grievance, right? So for example, if you have a personal problem, you go to your friend, you go to your mom, you go to your counselor, right? Before you go on local radio or on the news and say, so today, somebody cut me off. And it was, you don't do that, right? So we'll get to that in point 3. But your audience is the people that you gain credibility with. So for example, when I walk into a space, I work with predominantly older, predominantly white, affluent men, right? And I work in global security. So I work with men who genuinely really think their opinion is right all the time. And I think my opinion is right all the time. So it causes a few problems. But my audience is older white men. That's who I'm working with. That's the experience, life experience I work with. That's the mindset I work with. That's the language I sometimes have to communicate in. Right? Because I can't communicate with them the same way I would, for example, with one of my friends who I went to college with. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, now I get it.
So your audience is people that you gain credibility with. So as a minority community, what then is your target audience?
For me, it would be my Kenyan friends. Those are people we do life with. I think that would, at least for me here in the US, those who are like, I don't know.
What's your target audience as a minority community? You'll get. What's your target audience?
Do you like people who represent their political representatives?
Okay, political representatives are definitely part of it. What's your target audience? It's easier to picture this way. If something happens to your community, who do you seek out for justice or for support or for credibility or for a platform? Who do you want to pay attention to? Media is usually one of them. That's a target audience. Administration, that's an audience. How often is your audience people from your own community? How often is it people from your own community?
A lot of the time it's people that are populating the same constituency that you populate, demographics-wise, religion-wise, income-wise, race-wise.
Okay. So that's actually, and I'm glad you said something, that's actually quite true for white Americans. It is. For minorities, it's the opposite. For minority communities, your target audience is almost never your own minority community. Interestingly enough, when something happens to your community, you go to your own community to have grievances. You go and say, well, somebody was rude to me today, somebody swore at me on the street, et cetera, et cetera. But the people that you go to actually solve those challenges, the people that you go to actually give you some sort of leverage or platform or entrance into a hall of power are often not those within the minority community. They're usually more affluent, predominantly white, predominantly male. So if you go through the listservs of many organizations, when something happens in a community, they reach out to the senators, they reach out to the newsroom producers, they reach out to faculty within universities that have credible voices, etc. Across the board, predominantly white, predominantly male in the United States, which is challenge number 1 for a minority community. And I think it's the most important one because our audience should be people who sound and look like us. That should be our target audience when something happens. That should be the community that we go to and say, hey, we need to work on this together. For the most part, we don't. We go to our local community when we want to get support, when we want to have a louder voice, when we want it to be amplified, but we don't go to our community when we want a problem solved. Now, this is similar to one key area. There was a thesis recently written by a phenomenal student at the London School of Economics on the similarity between minority discourse and who their audience is with women who suffer sexual violence during conflict and who they seek support from. Even in the most patriarchal and culturally difficult societies, they still want male doctors. And they still want male doctors because when a female doctor comes in, they say, you look just like me, what are you gonna do? If I don't have power, then where are you getting yours from? So it's about power dynamics, who you assume has power in that community. Now, the reason I emphasize this is because as minority communities, there are 2 key things we have to remember. Our audience, right? And then our own internal grievance structure, or really what I call our community. So we've now spoken about the audience. We'll get into the community a little bit. How often, truly, do we sit down with our community and say, this is something that we can work on together if it does not relate to the minority you are? How often? Like how often, when was the last time the Muslim community sat down and said, you know, First Nations people have been struggling in this country for a long time. Let's have a conversation. Let's see what we can do. How can we leverage our systems of influence to do it? When was the last time?
I can tell you never.
Never. She was like, never. This never happened. No? When was the last time?
I'm a Christian, but I'm not speaking Muslims. I would say never, at least for us.
No, but it's a fair question. When was the last time within your community you sat down and said, listen, we occupy, because by nature there are spheres of power, right? You always hear, you know, my mother jokingly says, oh, the men, they might rule outside, but the women rule in the house. As a lot of older moms say it, whatever. But it's actually quite important because it's talking about spheres of power, right? So we all occupy a space of power. With a particular audience and group, I am more powerful than you, right? And with a particular audience, you are more powerful than me, right? So when in your community have you said, I'm going to leverage my power because your grievance is legitimate? Anyone?
I know after 9/11, a lot of people in the Japanese American community spoke out about backlash against Muslim Americans because of the history of
Internment camps.
and such. So I know that's just
No, that's a very good example. Is that the only example we can come up with?
So it's not an American example, but I'm from Kenya, and I was just looking into, again, the guy that introduced, I forgot his name, but the relationship between Muslims and Christians in my country is a very interesting relationship. We do life together, we buy from each other, and so whenever there's a terrorist attack, like, the Muslim leaders will come and say, they will take the Bible and say, this is now representative of Islam. And we've had instances now where we worship because like our churches have become targets. You have a lot of Muslim leaders stand outside for us to worship. And then even on buses, like you have when these people come in and say, oh, if you can't recite the Quran, or you can't do this. And we have people putting their lives on the line. Like a lot of Muslim people say, oh, you go through me. So like I see that a lot when like people are like, you know what, I'm gonna take this. It's not mine. I have this privilege.
Has that translated here in the US?
No, I don't know. I just
So-
didn't think so.
Right. So those are both majorities in their country, right? In Kenya, they both serve as majorities. There's enough of the population, Muslim and enough Christian, for them to both have leverage and influence,
So
right?
80% Christian and everything else like
Yeah.
comes 20. So
But that's significant. 20 is significant.
yeah, so
Right?
So it's significant.
Yeah. So, but here in the U.S., you're looking at less than what, 1 to 2%, I think it is. So that's the minority we're talking about. We're talking about minority politics right now. So it's a good example, but oftentimes in countries where there are, so for example, you can look at Singapore, and there are 4 religions, there's 4 languages, and they get on wonderfully, and that's because they each have enough leverage, enough influence to have some sort of political and economic and social voice. So we're talking more about a very unfair playing field situation, where if you are in a community, and there's either because of numbers, because of economic influence, because of social influence, because of political influence, there's a minority there. So in that situation, how often have you seen one minority stand up for the other is the question. And the answer is quite simple. It's exceptionally rare. It's actually exceptionally rare. The only time minorities usually stand up for each other is when the situation has either gotten so extreme that they sense that they will be the next minority to be targeted, or that it will set a pattern of behavior, acceptable political behavior, where they can be targeted down the line using the same metric. That's usually when people stand up. In both those cases, it's often because it either is connected to something they felt or something they will feel. So it's usually a very kind of inward-outward approach rather than an outward-inward, right? The reason I mention this is because oftentimes if we look at power dynamics, and if we look at what we call the power of minorities, your biggest challenge is being able to gain credibility and leverage outside of what we said was your community, right? So to be able to get that audience. Now, we often go to people we perceive to be the most powerful in our community. So we go to the elite, affluent, et cetera, media, political. We very rarely go to other minority audiences. Now, if you play any type of games like Risk, or you play any board games, right? Sometimes it's not necessarily going to the most powerful or affluent or but it's rather creating a larger starting voice, right? And the best way to do that is to be able to have credibility in relationships with other minority communities. That then gives you a majority you otherwise wouldn't have, or a semblance of a greater minority, right? So, now that we've laid the foundations, we're going to talk specifically about the Muslim American minority community. And the reason that I have emphasized those two things is because I'm going to sound very critical. It's all constructive though, but I needed to lay those two. Now, I think there are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences between the Canadian Muslim experience and the American Muslim experience. The American Muslim experience is painted with an entirely different history and an entirely different role in many ways. And I do think both of them share, though, some of the negative characteristics we'll talk about first, and then we're going to talk about opportunities, and then I'll open the floor. There are, I think, three things that we need to address within our own communities. Now, the very, I think, least one, the most minimally important, is our relationship with politicians or governance or security, et cetera, within our state or our city or our country. I actually think that comes the last on the list of priorities. The first would have to actually be prioritizing human rights within our community. It's very difficult to be able to get a united Muslim American voice if a lot of Muslim Americans do not feel as though they are part of a united Muslim American community, right? So if you belong to a community where you as a woman feel that you've been disrespected, where you as a black woman feel as though you've been ignored, or a black Muslim feels as though you've been ignored, or where you have fundamentally segregated communities, the Pakistanis, they pray here, the Arabs, they pray here, etc., it's very difficult for, in times of crisis, you to have any type of relationship with one another. Now, it's very common, it's minority politics, where we've been taught that only one person gets to sit at the top, right? And even though it's a minority, we have to be the top within that group, because we can't be the head, the big fish in the big pond. So we'll be the big fish in the little pond. And that usually means employing the same tools that we've seen in wider society. So racism, xenophobia, sexism, classism. We do the same thing within our smaller communities, which makes it almost illegitimate and kind of completely discredits us when we speak up about it on a global platform or on a national platform. Now, the best example I'll give of this is the recent Me Too movement. We have heard a lot of Muslim women come forward about sexism. A lot. And across the board, within Muslim communities, give or take a few leaders, they were told to stop talking because they're making the Islamophobes have more ammunition to attack Islam. That was what these women were told. You're making us look bad. People will say Islam oppresses women, et cetera, et cetera. There wasn't a huge groundswell of support to actually hear their experiences or their voices. Now, what that says to any other Muslim women in the community who might want to speak up is, this is not a safe space for you to speak. This is not where you need to come to. And she'll automatically assume her audience has to be somebody outside of that community, that she does not have a relationship of trust or safety within that community. Now, they might seem like little things, but when this happens multiple times, first with sexism, with racism, if you say, listen, this mosque, it doesn't treat us the same, right? It doesn't treat me the same. I'm a black Muslim, I'm not, but for example, I'm a black Muslim, I don't get treated the same, right? Or you go and you are less wealthy and you say, listen, the richer people, they've been making all the decisions. We don't have a voice here. We don't have a voice here. You don't have any ownership of your community. You're not going to feel accountable for your community or responsible for your community. And when your community comes calling on you to stand up for X, Y, and Z, oftentimes you're going to say, you did not stand up for me. Why should I stand up for you? Right? So internally, you have a fragmented system of amplification. You can't go to your audience with a united voice because there is no united voice. So that's challenge number one. You can't take on larger structures without any type of system of engagement internally. You can't. That doesn't mean there needs to be a hierarchy, but there definitely needs to be a trust and a credibility. And if you don't trust your religious leaders or your religious community, then when they go and say, listen, we need to take on the United States Senate or X, Y, and Z, you're going to say, this is not my fight. second important thing within the Muslim American community is that, my God, it does not know what it is. So we were on the way here, the driver was telling us about how his family is starting a therapy business. And one of the big groups that come to them is, parents who immigrated here, and their children, they don't understand their children. I mean, how many of you are kids of immigrants? How many times have your parents said, I did not do that when I was your age? Like, if I ever said that to my mother, I mean, I've heard that way more than I probably should have. But there's a huge divide within almost every major group in the U.S. right now. American Muslims are not any different. It's important, though. So, for example, if you look at, we said earlier, Trump's audience was white, evangelical, more conservative, et cetera, people who will not change their mind regardless of what he does, more or less, right? His audience is not Democrats. His audience is not liberals. His audience, so when people say, well, he has an overall negative rating in America, he really doesn't care. He cares about 5 states that he's got to swing, right? The Democratic Party, and the reason I think that Trump will probably get 8 years is because they have no idea who they are anymore. Their younger audience swings entirely progressive. It thinks that the establishment is entirely corrupt, et cetera, right? They don't have enough time to really rewind that clock or kickstart it, and they don't have a big enough name to be able to compete with the name recognition that Trump has, right? It's a tough win. If they do it, alhamdulillah, but it's a tough win. That being said, the Muslim American audience is quite similar. The community is very similar. We have a generation that has been here for some time and was told you need to assimilate. You don't get to keep any of your cultural characteristics to be part of this community, you need to assimilate. So we have a lot of grandparents and great aunties, et cetera, who assimilated. That's what they were told they had to do to succeed. And they did, by their standards, succeed. They were happy with what, you know what, fine, you can insult me in the street, but I have a job, my kids get to go to good school, et cetera, right? That was the landmark. Then you had their kids and their grandkids, who were raised both with their identities as Muslims or from their own cultural background, but also told you're an American or you're a Canadian, so you deserve rights and freedoms. You're going to have to continually validate that you deserve these rights and freedoms because of your second identity, but you deserve them. You can go anywhere in the world and show them your passport and you get better treatment. So they had these two compelling narratives, right, that are completely contradictory. On one hand, you are the child of an immigrant, your parents have stolen our jobs, et cetera, you should leave. On the other, you get to fulfill the American dream. 90% of businesses are created by kids who are immigrants or second generation, right? You had these two completely different narratives that helped dictate a lot of who you were supposed to be and how you were supposed to be. And you had them both externally with the general American community, but also within your community. Within your community, you had aunties and uncles saying, listen, you need to get married, you need to have kids, you need to do X, Y, and Z, you need to check all the cultural boxes, but you also had aunties and uncles saying, you need to be a doctor, you need to be an electrician, you need to be a lawyer, you need to be an engineer, because you have to prove that it was worth our time, worth our sacrifice to bring you here, right? So that's the narrative they grew up with. And that narrative has become increasingly fragmented and increasingly divisive. Because oftentimes you'll be told that you have to choose one or the other by one community or the other. And on the fringes of that, you now have the influx, or you continually have the influx of new immigrants and new refugees. And the vast majority of them employ the former assimilation model rather than the multicultural model. So younger Muslim Americans are competing with multiple things. They exist in a country they were raised in with friends who may not look like them, but definitely sound and think like them. And they also have that cultural reality of what their parents brought, what their grandparents brought. So they spend in accordance, they vote in accordance, they pick classes in accordance with that. Where you'll find that minorities, second generation immigrants in particular, have the highest rates of masters and PhDs. They are the single most successful when starting a business. They have the highest percentage of returning investment into their community. Right? But there's the flip side. There's the flip side. When the young minority messes up. That's the flip side. Because often what we see is that there isn't that initial sense of community that they didn't have translates most strongly there. And you find a significant number of that population pulling away from that larger community, either because they felt it didn't have their back, or they saw what it did to somebody else who may have made a mistake and not fallen in line with what was community acceptable. The reason I mention this point is because if you do not know who your community is, then you don't trust them enough to air grievances to them. You don't trust them enough to go to the mosque and say, guys, I'm having a lot of trouble with my belief because I think maybe I need to understand, is Islam sexist? Is Islam racist? How many of us would feel comfortable going to our local mosque or our local congregation and asking that question? You?
I'll speak for me. I'm a weird Christian. I do 4 churches, but all of those churches are different. So in my church, we go to a Pentecostal, but I'm going to a Southern Baptist church. I would not even dare question that I'm doubting anything because I'll be crucified. But if I go to a more progressive, and also like depends if there are more people of color there I'm allowed to question. So you just need to know like
which community you're speaking with.
Yeah, so like I don't know if it's the same in Islam, but for me in Christianity you have everything. So like just know.
Well, who here is Muslim? I'm going to pick on somebody.
Yeah.
Would you go to your community and ask them? Would you go to the MSA and say, guys, I think we're being a bit sexist here?
Yeah, I do.
And what's the response?
Not great usually. I mean, I grew up differently than a lot of my peers here. Like most places I grew up like had gender adjacent prayer, and I didn't grow up in the mosque. I grew up actually at the university in the city, but my professor was like young students giving papers. So I always felt empowered to do that, and then meeting more people who didn't have that, I realized like, oh, this is different. But I don't typically not say. Like, I do say something, but it definitely has like an effect on how much you feel like you're part of the community.
And when you do speak up and the response is negative, do you feel like you want to continue to be part of that community, or have you felt like maybe I need to go and create my own, or?
I think that there's definitely times where you just get tired and you're like, it's not worth it, I'm just gonna sleep. And other times you're like, maybe you want to be a part of it.
Does anyone else feel differently, that they can go to their community?
Yeah, I grew up in also daughter of immigrants where we were always viewed as more liberal than everybody else, right? Really, I don't think we were, but that was just the perception because primarily because we were white people, my mother and us, sisters. And so anytime, my mother would have something to say, my father would be criticized that my mother was speaking up, which was one thing. And so my sister and I grew up feeling very little attachment to our local community. We always felt ostracized because of the way we looked and because of, having a mother who was more vocal, but who was not appreciated for that voice.
So it created a sense of detachment.
Right, and my sisters and I don't know
How many people here have heard of like the unmosqued movement? Yeah. Where a lot of women don't go to mosques anymore for that reason, where they feel as though they can't be vocal, etc. So this core dilemma between knowing your own community and also knowing your audience and gaining credibility with that audience and recognizing the challenges within your own community, they're fundamentally important because your sense of detachment means that, arguably, when something does happen to said community, you won't feel as much attachment to it then either, right? This isn't a community that maybe you joined a club in university where you felt you were a lot more listened to and a lot more heard, and that's where you invest your time and your energy and your outrage if something happens, right? So the reason this is important is because the US and the world are arguably changing, right? The US, for the first time ever, will be a minority white country within the next 20, 30 years. Which is interesting because you're going to have a large group of minorities, right? Where all these different minority groups either have to work together or not work at all. And the challenge there becomes, what is the role of minorities in a changing America? What's your role? Is it to only speak up when a Muslim ban happens to your community? Is it to only speak up when something happens specifically to your community? Or does your audience need to be different? Does your audience need to be more diverse, inclusive, far-reaching? Do you need to go and get attached to your local religious or spiritual or academic center? Or does your audience get to be somebody entirely different? Your community get to be somebody entirely different? Do you get to create your own community? Anybody? I know it's Thursday night, but y'all got to be a lot more participatory.
I'll go again at the risk of like saying something odd. But I do believe, for me at least, as a person of color, I found it better if I know that my audience right now doesn't look at me. So I have allies in my audience who can speak up for me in places I can't be because I'm not accepted. So that has been my strategy, like finding, that's just how it goes.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. But what's the solution? If the US is changing, if one by one civil liberties are being removed, what's the strategy? Everybody in here is arguably a minority in one way or another, right?
Yeah.
Except for maybe you. Sorry to put you on the spot. You too. You too. You're only, oh no, we got three. We have three. But what's the strategy? That's easy to say. What's the actual strategy? Hannah, I'm going to pick on you. What's the strategy?
You're right in saying that it's just easy to work together. Maybe uplifting young people is how I'm working together right now. And that just comes with action, like electing young people and giving young people funds to
And where do we start with that? Where do we start with that? I mean, academic institutions are usually the worst. They really are. In terms of sexism and in terms of ageism and classism, academic institutions are statistically one of the worst places, so that's definitely not going to start here. Probably not.
I think what you were saying is it should be responded to like Muslim that happens and stuff. I think that's where that needs to change instead of and I know you said this, like it needs to stop being like, oh, these are like Muslim issues. You need to be like in your own communities thinking about like how do we help Muslim? How do we help how do we leverage what we can do for them
Mhm.
like so that our school should be like, you know, what are the things that Muslims have primary
Mhm, mhm.
because we are primary and it should be the better just of like the country that we belong to as well, so it should, or the global world we belong to.
100%. How do we do that within Muslim communities? How do you do that within your minority community?
I feel like recognizing that the people with different communities in different groups within. So we can be talking like in the Muslim community and talk about LGBTQ issues or like Black issues and complex human things. Like your community is just because one oppressed or minority entity.
Perfect. How do we make that our mainstream conversation within that minority community?
I guess just like uplifting and recognizing voices that are just one.
There you go. We can't elect youth politicians on a global or on a national or state scale if we haven't done it within our own communities. If within the Muslim community the vast majority are younger people, then why are they not sitting on the boards of mosques, not just in MSAs, but on the boards of mosques? Or why isn't there some sort of rotating chair within your local mosque of MSA members? Why are we not saying to Muslim LGBTQ members or Muslim women or any minority within the Muslim community, hey, we'd like to have you seated at this table? And that goes for all minorities. How are we going to amplify issues when we don't actually think those issues exist in our space if we don't have those voices telling us about them? Right? So this is where I'll close on, is the call to action bit, the recommendation. You are, the predominant percentage of you are younger, right? You're in university or I assume most of you are in university. Yeah? Yeah? Hopefully enjoying it a little bit. And you've hopefully created some communities for yourself here, right? And those communities, you have credibility with them, they trust you, and they listen to you. Yes? And those communities are probably somewhat diverse. I actually don't know if that's true since this is Duke, but let's pretend they're somewhat diverse. But they come from different backgrounds, they have different life experiences. Now, if you have that community, what's to say that you cannot enter spaces with the leverage and support of the community you have cultivated to transform the communities that you believe should be transformed that you also belong to? Whether you feel great attachment to them or not, the reality is they are infinitely important. Both in terms of the fact that they will impact the way that you or your family members are treated, but also from the fact that they are going to continue to become greater political, economic, and social powers. And I, for one, I mean, I'm Muslim, right? And we can all agree that the way that Islam has been interpreted and employed is not always great for women around the world. And I, for one, fundamentally believe that Muslim women should have been part of the conversation and should be part of the conversation, but should have demanded to be part of the conversation much sooner, before it became so socialized and so normalized that that's the way that they should be treated. So if we know that there is a significant amount of power in community, and that our communities are only going to continue to get larger and more financially and socially and powerful, then what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? So don't stop speaking up, but just next time bring people who actually agree with you too. Bring people who agree with you. And begin to utilize the community that you've leveraged, the community that sees eye to eye with you, with the community that has greater social, economic, and political power. Now, I'm not saying it always works. A lot of people say, well, oh, he's working there, he's going to transform it from the inside out, da 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 da. It doesn't always work. I work with the UN. Believe me, it does not always work. Some communities are very slow or very bureaucratic, and they take time. But the reality is, it either continues to work in the way it does and expand without your input, influence, and energy, or it does change over time. And you get to build a community in your likeness, in a community that actually cares about issues of classism or racism or sexism. And a community that has greater external credibility because it speaks up when other people are offended or hurt as well. Not only speaks up for itself. A community that other communities come to and say, listen, we'd like some support. We know you guys always stand up for others. That's how minority communities get to gain political, economic, and social power. Now, it's a complete oversimplification. The realities exist. There are structural inequalities, systemic racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those, I argue, will not go away. Usually when minorities begin to feel that their position, majorities begin to feel that their power position is threatened, they hold on to it a lot tighter. So this is not going to go away anytime soon. It's going to be a conversation that's a lot more us and them than it used to be. Because now every time people walk out of their homes, they see us and them very distinctively in front of them. And many people feel like they're seeing a lot too many of them and not enough of us. Whoever them and us may be for them. So the conversation isn't going away. Which means for the first time in a long time, the US has a completely changing power system. It's exciting. It might not seem like it because you guys have Trump right now. But no, I'm serious. It might not seem like it, but it's so exciting. For the first time in a long time, conversations are being had because the voices of the people who have been oppressed are loud enough for the conversations to be taking place in the first place. Isn't that kind of cool? Like, it might seem like everything's downhill and people are acting in ways they didn't used to act. They always acted like that. They just weren't as public about it. And it's like, the best analogy I've ever heard of this is, and it's an awful, actually, example. I probably shouldn't say it, but I will because it's the only one I can think of, is when there's those, what are they called? The ones that kids own at home, iguanas? iguanas, the reptiles or the amphibians, I don't know, that kids own, but apparently when you throw a rock at them, they like get like bigger and angrier. And then they, whenever they feel cornered, they come out bigger and angrier. It's true. So that's the reality of the changing social, let's call it mosaic of America, which means it's the first time that power is truly legitimately up for grabs. And the likelihood to actually get it is a lot higher if you can get people in those offices, people in those businesses, people in those media companies from within your own communities and that have credibility. And that's not saying they have to be Muslim American. That's saying that they have to be of a community that amplifies and is excited about and cares about the same issues you care about. Whether you've cultivated that community on your own or whether you've transformed an existing one. Yeah? So everybody's plan of action is to run for office.
Yeah, I am doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, you should. Start a business. Or start looking around your own community and saying, whose voices are being silenced? Who is not being heard? How can I, having experienced what I've experienced with my mother, go into that same community today and demand better for young girls? Because who else has that point of view? Right? There's a certain amount of power in that. That you had the privilege of being able to go into that community and saying, we can do better. So, who's running for office?
2040.
Come on, guys. Literally none of you? You want to? Did you want to before you came to this? Oh, well, damn it. I didn't inspire anybody. Lie to me and say you're all running. But floor is open for questions.
It's not really a question, but I think it's I actually did come for this talk because I just looked at your profile and I was like, I'll have to listen to you. Yeah, because I have a master's in global health and I'm Ireland as well. So, but the thing about me, so I'm African, and I have never, I'm from Africa and from Kenya, I have never.
You're from Kenya, really? No way.
But the thing is, for the first time in my life, I moved here when I was 26 years for, I got a scholarship to do my master's degree. But I moved here at 26 years of age. I was already a leader, I'm already vocal, raised like that, like a son and everything. But then to come here and to become Black, that was an experience for me. For the first time in my life, people will look at me and they will stop at my skin color. And so when they stopped at my skin color, they didn't know my story. They didn't know how growing up in rural Kenya, we were poor, the poor called us poor. And like growing up and struggling to be educated as a woman in a patriarchal system, struggling and saying, you know what, one day I'm gonna get out of this country because I had a dream. So people just stop at the skin color. And so to be Black for me, it's been amazing to now be Black and to enjoy it. First I resented it, but now I love being a Black woman. And so for me—
What changed, if you don't mind me asking?
It changed because I started learning about African American history. And then I realized that the sacrifices that African Americans had made for me as a Black person to be here. One of them being the first Black person to come to Duke was in 1963. That was the first Black person ever. And I guess for me, I had a deeper appreciation because I started understanding like systemic racism. When African migrants come here, so we come here very educated. We start looking at African Americans as lazy, as how can they have all these things that they don't get? But we don't understand like the systemic racism and
Yes.
And also, we feel like as Africans, we get the benefits of Black people, which makes us rise faster without the emotional baggage that comes with being Black because we can grow up here. And so we get to reap from the system, and so we get to like also look down because now we are moving faster than them. But the thing about it in the African American community, and I just started doing stand-up comedy last week because I felt like that's the only way I can reach Black folk, is colorism, which is actually tied to classism. So within the African American community, even within my own community in Kenya, is if you're light skinned.
But where did that come from, colorism?
It has a long history.
Yeah, but where?
I think it came from the days of slavery and.
But from who?
From Thomas Jefferson.
It came from colonization and slavery.
As well, because also the light, if you are the light slave, you worked in the house.
Exactly.
If you were darker, you worked in the plantation. And so the ones in the house got treated better.
Well, prior to that, prior to that, when colonizers first went to Africa, they selected which families they would associate with and work with based on skin color, right? And so a lot of the divisions that we now see in Africa based on skin color were not there inherently. It's the same with the treatment of women. A lot of traditional African cultures were a lot more matriarchal than they were patriarchal, and that changed when Europeans and came to Africa. So we have to be very aware that they're not
It's not our own making.
they're not indigenous to us, right? Because that's important. We have to start saying that this did not exist before. Language is important, and the way we teach our own future generations is important. When we're talking about colorism, we need to talk about the fact that certain ideals of beauty were prioritized, and it wasn't necessarily done so by us, right? When we're talking about sexism, we have to talk about the roots. Because then, 100 years later, people get to turn around and say, well, you guys are really sexist, right? And we start sitting there being like, wait, what? When we have to know our histories, and we have to know that that wasn't inherent in our cultures until it was imported into our cultures. That becomes very important, right?
I guess for me, I've just been during this whole period as an immigrant. Believe it or not, I've not had a job in 8 months. I am an RN licensed in 24 states. I have a freaking master's from Global Health with Duke, and I've worked with Duke, and so it's been an amazing story to be poor in America, I guess, because I'm uninsured. Living with friends and stuff. So for me, it's been awesome to be black and to be sort of quote unquote poor, because when I say I don't have a job and I'm black, there's always the stereotype that jumps in until I have to qualify my not having a job as an immigrant. But it's been hard. I don't know, I feel like now I want to speak in my community, we have to address the colorism that comes with classism. So I guess for me, I'm just saying all of it that I'm taking away from this is I feel now, not more empowered, but I'm more I feel more energized to do
the internal work.
Yeah, the internal work, because I feel like sometimes it's so easy to look at external and not deal with the internal, and then we lose credibility.
100%. You lose credibility and support. No, that's very true.
Yeah. So that was just it.
This is a more Muslim specific question. But I feel like when
Those Muslims, everybody's talking about them.
I feel like when you try to talk to your Muslim community about introducing more space and resources instead of programming and trying to shift ideology, there's kind of this backlash that's you're just letting America transform Islam, and you're removing it from its highest roots or whatever, which is really risk. It's as if Islam isn't practiced within the cultural lens in every other place it's practiced. But I was wondering how you recommend kind of responding to that, because I know this issue in the past 3 weeks, all of us have been, America is transforming Islam. And I haven't gotten that.
I haven't gone. So I'm arguably, here's where we get to talk about my failures. I am probably the worst person to ask this question to, because, and I will be very honest with you, I have felt a detachment, I would say, from the Muslim American community for a while. I don't work on Muslim American specific issues or Muslim specific issues. I work on global issues of security and peace and health, etc. And so my community has changed in that regard, and the community that has supported me when I've been in places of difficulty has not been usually the Muslim American community. They've actually usually been a lot more critical of my work of my voice until they felt it served them. And so I have a very different relationship there in that regard. And it became about, I stopped going to the mosque years ago because I felt like the rooms for the women just kept getting smaller. And I am not about that life, so I was like, nah. And I actually started changing my mind very recently. A friend of mine who lives in Austin named Lila Igram, who has this organization called Connect Her, which is amazing. And I will give her this credit because she deserves it. She has 3 kids about my age, and she said to me, if everybody starts leaving the mosque and nobody feels responsible for it, it's going to continue to be a place of congregation, particularly for people first coming to the U.S., for immigrants and refugees coming to the U.S. from this community. They're going to go there, and those are the only voices they get to hear. They don't get to hear anybody else's voice. So it might be exceptionally frustrating for you, but you have to do the same service that your parents did. when other people came, because my parents were super active in the mosque, and they always, if somebody new came, they helped them find a flat, they had their apartment, etc. And so she said, you owe your community that same service, because you got privileges because of the support system and the network that existed for your parents. And that's true. My parents felt a lot more comfort, they felt a lot more welcome, they felt a lot more home because of their community, and that did translate into them feeling a lot better about their lives in Canada and raising us in a different way, right? So they got a lot of emotional support from that community. And as difficult as it is for me, because I feel as though that community does not envision the reality the same way I do, I have to do the same thing, right? That's a service that you give back to your community because you've benefited from it. That's a privilege we've gotten. Now, that's so much easier said than done, because you're going to hear a lot worse than America is transforming Islam, right? That you individually are westernized, that you're trying to change and brainwash the children, especially the girls, so you'll hear a lot worse. And I think for me, it stopped being about going and telling everybody they were wrong, to more being about asking people why they think they're right. Because religion's deeply personal, right? And if I go and talk to a woman about the way she looks at women's rights, a mom, someone my mom's age, she's usually had kids, daughters and sons, and she's raised them in the same belief system that she herself was raised in, that her mother taught her, that her community told her was acceptable. So you're going to somebody and saying everything you believe, everything you've been taught by the people you trust and love the most, everything you've taught the people you trust and love the most is fundamentally wrong. That's what you're saying. And you might feel like you're 100% right. I feel like I'm 100% right when I talk about women's empowerment. But that doesn't change the fact that the person I'm having a conversation with feels as though I'm saying every inch of your life's work in this area has been flawed at its foundation. And that's a tough conversation for them to have. So I think for me, that's what changed it. It stopped being about, okay, you know what? Fine. America's transforming Islam. How? Tell me how. Tell me why you feel this way, right? And you can transfer it to any issue. So politically, okay, so minorities are all taking your jobs. Tell me how. Tell me why you feel this way. And those are a lot tougher conversations to have, because the person you're talking to, but the person you're talking to has to be very open to being reflective, and you have to be very open to listening to opinions that you might not necessarily want to listen to. The reality is that's the only way you actually move a conversation forward without both parties feeling offended or upset. And I would think the people who have taught me that most are actually family members that are not my immediate family, but my extended family. When I would talk to them about women's rights, across the board initially felt very offended and insulted by what I was saying. And it made me realize that, if my mom had taught me something, I lived my whole life with it. The barriers and restrictions in my life were set by that belief system. So let's say I went on, I became a mom, I didn't have the job I have, et cetera, because my mother told me that. And I love those people and they loved me, and I went and I taught that to my daughters, right? Then the impact of somebody who is a quarter my age coming and telling me everything you've ever believed is fundamentally wrong is going to seem like an attack. So it becomes a lot more about, okay, why? When you go to those halakas, and you should go watch Fox News, go to every conversation that people are having. I think it's great to have as much knowledge as you possibly can. But go and ask them, why is it changing? Why do you feel it's changing? Are you feeling heard, and are you feeling needed? Because usually communities tend to get much more isolated when they feel either like they're under attack or when members of that same community feel as though they're no longer necessary or needed, right? So human emotion underlies it all. And that's usually, at least in my, but to be fair, I still barely go to the mosque, so don't listen to me. Any other questions?
I would just say an example for me. So I tend to be more on the left in terms of politics. In my church, actually 75% of my church, I go to a multi-ethnic church, so it's Southern Baptist, very conservative. 75% of my church voted for Trump. And so Black people voted on the left, white people voted for Trump. And it's been amazing to go to a Bible study where it's the people that voted for Trump, and usually people see us as Christian, but when we are there, like, you know, it's kind of like just different to have that conversation. But it's been just awesome to hear someone out without me saying anything. And it's something I realized I never used to listen. I always thought I'm the one who knows, you know, I'm right on this issue, I'm right on this issue. And one of the things that I, especially as a healthcare provider, am very passionate about is vaccines. And there's this notion that vaccines cause autism and stuff. And so to sit with a, I don't call it boxes or what, but to be able to sit with this person and say, okay, I'm just gonna listen.
I don't sit with anti-vaxxers. Nope. That's where I draw the line. No. Child abusers, like pedophiles and anti-vaxxers, the only two people I'm just like, nope.
It was so good, but the thing is, this is what I'm telling you, this was good because I was actually in Texas, and this woman told me, this is the first time somebody has heard me. And I felt like, okay, I've heard, and now I heard you, so now you're gonna hear me. But the thing is, I was just saying, like, trying to listen to someone, it's really hard though.
Yeah, and you don't always go in with the expectation that listening is going to be reciprocated, right?
Yeah.
That's the other thing.
Yeah.
So you go in and you listen, and they might not want to listen back, and that's fine, but you've at least began a relationship or started a conversation, or at least you have the foundation of what's actually motivating them to be able to address people who are in the same position as them, right? But no, I don't negotiate with anti-vaxxers. I have like a hard line on that. Now, okay.
Sorry. I feel like in the U.S., like minority groups can be pitted against each other a lot. So how do we combat that? Being more solidarity?
Well, that's actually a very deliberate approach, right? Is if you have minorities to ensure that they have enemies within each other rather than one common enemy, right? I shouldn't use the word enemy, but we will because that's the word I can think of right now. But so that's a very common approach, and I think part of it comes down to actually introducing those communities to one another in non-threatening ways. So if you belong to, and most of us now do belong to multiple communities, right? So I belong to a community of women, I belong to a community of Muslims, I belong to a community of healthcare professionals, and it's introducing those communities to one another and saying this is a perspective that I can bring to the table in this regard, and these are voices that also agree with me, right? And having that relationship where you're actually listening to each other, not only when one community has negatively impacted the other. Do you get what I'm saying? Or not only when you've been impacted and I think it might happen to me next, but rather starting that conversation at its infant stages. And a good example of this lately, very recently, in Canada, I was born and raised in a city called Saskatoon, and it has one of the highest per capita crime rates in Canada, and it's very divided. I mean, if you go there and ask people, okay, so people will tell you the east side is safer, the west side has a lot more First Nations communities, and First Nations communities in Canada suffer a lot of the same structural racism and oppression that's happened here in the US, and Canada has a very, very terrible history in that regard, and terrible present, to be quite fair. In the past month, 2 crimes have, a judge and jury have found the murderers of 2 First Nations people, Colton Boucher and Tina Fontaine, not guilty. And those juries were made up entirely of non-First Nations people. And those judges had a history of racist verdicts in the past. And so it was a very racially charged conversation, rightfully so. And it was the first time I've seen the Muslim community really begin to say, we need to start talking about this. And it's awful that it came to that, but it was the first time I saw them say, why don't we invite them here? Why don't we have round tables with them? Why don't we just ask them how they're doing and bake them some casseroles, right? Like, why don't we be present and there for them? Why don't we go on the marches on City Hall for them? And they wrote letters to the mayor. And it was the first time that I felt, and I was very proud. I'm not a huge, very vocal member of that community, but it was the first time I felt a huge sense of pride, because it wasn't about, hey, this has happened to us, someone's insulted us, et cetera. It was about, what can we do? How can we serve you? And I feel like that should be the basis of all religious and spiritual communities. How can we be of service, right? And so, for me, you know, and I hate that it was those 2 verdicts that got it there, but I do think it started a conversation where the First Nations community, members of the First Nations community in Saskatoon, truly felt listened to, and their voices were amplified. And I hope that continues, and my hope would be that it doesn't take, you know, catastrophic events for it to continue. But it's really about what communities are you a part of? Who do you know? You might not even be a part of those communities. You might be friends with somebody in one of your classes who is a member of those communities. And how do you sit down with each other and say, this is something we need to talk about, right? Or how can we help? Like, how can we be of service? But it's tough, and they're going to continue to be pitted against each other as they begin to gain different levels of influence. And
if I may, this might be one of the only occasions that we've had a speaker fly around the world and then give a talk. So by Alaa's internal clock, it's probably after midnight for her. And I hope not a lot of us would be asked to lead an honest and difficult and challenging and inspiring talk after midnight. So if you would, please join me in thanking Alaa.
Thank you. Thank you all.